What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to eRock on Deck. My name is Eric. I go by eRock, and today we're doing another benchmarking video. About 5 months ago, I released my first ever benchmarking video, and much to my surprise, it has now become my #1 most viewed video on this channel. And for that, I say thank you. I am upgrading from the AMD Ryzen 3800X to the AMD Ryzen 5800X, and I'm asking the question, was it worth the upgrade? Now let's talk about the testing conditions. I ran a wide variety of benchmarks, all at 1440p as well as 1080p at ultra settings. So as you're looking at the frame rate, if you're thinking to yourself, man, I really think he should have higher FPS than that, just keep in mind that most people are not going to game at ultra settings. And so as you turn the settings down, the FPS will increase. Each set of benchmarks you're going to see will be 1080p for the 3800X, immediately followed by 1080p for the 5800X, and then 1440p for the 3800X and 1440p for the 5800X. Now for today's testing hardware, we're using the exact same PC as last time, which consists of the following components: the NVIDIA RTX 3070 Founders Edition using the stock cooler, an Asus ROG Strix X570E gaming motherboard, 32 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance RAM running at 3200 megahertz. We're using two different CPUs for our testing, the AMD Ryzen 3800X and the AMD Ryzen 5800X, and our cooling solution for the CPUs will be an AIO from Corsair, which has a radiator size of 240. Now really quickly, if you're new here and you like this type of content, please hit that subscribe button, because that is a good way of letting me know that I need to keep making this type of content for you. Now without any further ado, let's go ahead and hop on into the benchmarks. So kicking things off, we have everybody's favorite game, Fortnite.
Bruh.
We're starting off with the 3800X at 1080p. We're using the Epic in-game settings preset. And as you can see, we have an average frame rate of 167 FPS. So overall, this is not terrible performance by any means at all, but clearly if you're playing a competitive shooter and you want the highest FPS possible, then you can lower your settings and definitely improve your frame rate. Now switching over to the 5800X, again, it's 1080p using the Epic preset. And as you can see, we have quite a substantial performance increase in terms of overall frame rate. We're averaging 227 FPS, and we're also experiencing close to that same average, again, which is always a really good thing to see. And as stated previously, if you lower your settings, then your frame rate will actually increase even more. But I would actually question how many people out there actually have a gaming monitor that can do higher than 227 FPS. Now switching over to 1440p, going back to the 3800X, you can see we have an average frame rate of 121 FPS, but we're actually experiencing a frame rate between 135 to 145 FPS. And again, this is lower because it is 1440p, which is always going to be more demanding than 1080p. If we were to switch over to 4K, the frame rate would actually decrease even more. So resolution definitely plays a big factor here. Now switching over to the 5800X, again, it's 1440p at the Epic preset, and you can see that we have an average frame rate of 206 FPS, and we're actually experiencing somewhere between 205 FPS all the way up to 230 FPS right now. So that's actually quite a substantial performance increase, again, even at 1440p. So when it comes to Fortnite, the 5800X is proving to be quite a substantial performance increase over the 3800X. So if you're a hardcore Fortnite player, then I would argue you would probably get your money's worth out of the CPU for this game. So switching things away from shooters for just a second, we're looking at Dirt 5. With Dirt 5, unfortunately, there is literally no performance increase when upgrading to the 5800X, not even at 1080p. I ran the in-game benchmark, and at 1080p using the 3800X, we have 126 FPS on average. With the 5800X at 1080p, I have 124 FPS on average. So a lot of people would say, oh, you actually lost performance. I would actually classify that as margin of error and actually say that that's basically the same exact performance. So kicking things up a notch and switching to 1440p, using the 3800X, we have 103 frames on average. And when we switch it over to the 5800X and we run the in-game benchmark one more time, once again, we can see we also have 103 frames on average. So there is literally no performance benefit in upgrading your CPU for this title. Switching things over to Horizon Zero Dawn, I ran the in-game benchmark, and once again, we are starting off with a 3800X at 1080p, and the average frame rate that we get is 111 FPS. Now, when I switch over to the 5800X and run the exact same test, I get 125 FPS. So there is actually quite a noticeable performance increase at 1080p. But when we switch over to 1440p, the average frame rate for the 3800X is only 101 FPS. And when we switch over to the 5800X, 5800X, we have 107 FPS. So basically within margin of error and not much of a performance benefit at all. Now switching over to a more popular title like Call of Duty Warzone, we're kicking things off at 1080p using the 3800X, and we have an average frame rate of 146 FPS, and we're actually experiencing in the 130s, 132 FPS, 130 FPS, somewhere in that ballpark. Again, very respectable. So switching things over to the AMD Ryzen 5800X at 1080p, you can see we have an average frame rate of about 160 frames, and we're actually experiencing close to that. We're actually in the 150s right now, and that's actually quite respectable. It's not a massive performance increase over the 3800X, but the performance increase is there. It's subtle, but it is there. Switching things over to 1440p using the 3800X, you can see we have an average frame rate of almost 120 frames, and we're actually experiencing a little bit above that right now, currently sitting at 125, 130, bouncing back and forth. There's a little bit of a performance decrease there, again, because it's 1440p, but still very respectable. Switching over to the 5800X at 1440p, you can see we have an average frame rate of about 124 to 125 FPS, and we're actually experiencing close to that as well, from the low 120s up to the low 130s. So there's not really a performance benefit here using the 5800X at 1440p. You're looking at about a 5 frame difference between the 3800X and the 5800X, and this can be considered margin of error. But again, this is 1440p, so this is about what you would expect. Now switching things over to Doom Eternal, we're running the Ultra Nightmare game preset at 1080p using the 3800X. And as you can see, we have an average frame rate of close to 350 FPS, but we're actually experiencing a frame rate closer to the lower 300s and even sometimes dipping down to the mid 250s. Now switching things over to the 5800X at 1080p, you can see we have an average frame rate of almost 330 FPS. And our actual frame rate is actually fluctuating between the low to mid 250s all the way up to actual 300 FPS at times. And so this is technically a little bit of a performance decrease, and I'm not really sure why that is. I don't know if maybe this section of this level is a little bit more demanding than the previous section, or if this actually falls within margin of error. I'm not really sure how to explain this performance decrease. Now kicking things up to 1440p using the 3800X, you can see we have an average frame rate of 288 FPS, and we're actually experiencing a frame rate closer to 250 to 275. It's fluctuating, of course. Overall, the frame rate has gone down since we kicked it up to 1440p, but that's exactly what we would expect to see. But this is still phenomenal performance overall for the 3800X. Switching things over to the 5800X at 1440p, it says we have an average frame rate of about 415 frames, but I assure you that's probably not really accurate. As you can see, we're actually experiencing a frame rate in the 200s. Sometimes it dips below 200 into the 190s, and sometimes it rises up to 250. So overall, this still seems like it's a slight performance decrease compared to the 3800X, which would fall in line with our 1080p results. Again, I can't really explain why this is happening, but if you have an AMD Ryzen 3000 series CPU, I think this just further proves that there's not really a lot of value in upgrading to a Ryzen 5000 series CPU for this game, as well as a few other titles. For the final game in the benchmarking test results, I ran the Division 2's in-game benchmark. Kicking things off with the 3800X at 1080p, we have an average frame rate of 121 FPS. When we step over to the 5800X, we have an average frame rate of 129 FPS. So there is a performance increase, but it's very small. I mean, we're talking 8 frames here. That's not really something you're going to visually notice on the screen. When we step things up to 1440p, we do notice a performance decrease, which is exactly what we would expect to see. So with the 3800X at 1440p, we have an average frame rate of 80 FPS. When we switch over to the 5800X, we have an average frame rate of 93 FPS. So the margin between these two CPUs is actually greater at 1440p than it is at 1080p, which is actually quite interesting because usually we would expect that to be the exact opposite. So in conclusion, was it worth the upgrade? Well, overall, I am very happy with my Ryzen 5000 series CPU. I think the 5800X is a phenomenal CPU, and I am grateful for the performance increases that I did receive. However, if you're already using a Ryzen 3000 series CPU the same way that I was with the 3800X, then you're only going to get a little bit of a performance increase. It's not necessarily like a massive night and day increase. And unfortunately, the cost to upgrade is actually quite substantial. So I cannot really say that you're going to really justify the cost that it's going to take in order for you to upgrade from the Ryzen 3000 up to the Ryzen 5000. But of course, as with all things, this is going to be completely subjective, and it's going to depend on you and your particular use case and why you may be upgrading to a new CPU anyway. Well, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button. It goes a long way in helping me out. Let me know in the comments below, do you think it was worth the upgrade for me? I'm very curious to see what you guys think now that you've seen all the testing. And let me know also if there's any other type of hardware related benchmarks you want me to run, because I will be more than happy to do that for you. And until next time, E-Rock out. You can try to make an aesthetically pleasing build. I wasn't able to water cool my GPU. I wasn't able to get a block. I met a guy on Facebook and he has an RTX 3070 Founders Edition, and he plasti dipped his and it looked incredible. And so we're gonna attempt to do the same thing.